March 18, 1943. North Atlantic Ocean, 300 miles south of Greenland. The sea was a moving graveyard of black water and broken moonlight, rolling endlessly beneath a lid of low cloud and freezing wind. Waves rose like dark mountains and collapsed into white violence against the steel flanks of the USS Callaway, a destroyer escort riding the convoy line at battle speed. Ice clung to railings. Men moved carefully, boots slipping on frozen spray. Every breath turned to smoke before vanishing into the wind. Below the surface, the ocean was alive with predators. German U-boats waited in the deep like coiled steel snakes, listening, calculating, tracking the pulse of propellers above. Every convoy that crossed these waters carried food, fuel, ammunition, and the nervous hearts of hundreds of sailors who knew the Atlantic had already swallowed tens of thousands of men. The war in 1943 was being decided as much in darkness beneath the waves as on any battlefield on land. On the forward deck of the Callaway, a solitary figure stood beside the depth-charge racks, hands resting on cold metal. Petty Officer Daniel Mercer did not look like a man about to make history. He was slight, quiet, methodical. No one noticed him unless something broke. Yet beneath his steady exterior, his mind was working through numbers, delays, distances, probabilities. He listened to sonar pings echo through the hull like a mechanical heartbeat. Somewhere below, an enemy submarine was listening back. The order came suddenly. Contact bearing 180. The ship surged forward. Engineers pushed the engines harder. Sonar operators leaned over glowing screens. The Atlantic began to tremble with anticipation. Depth charges were rolled into position along the stern. Each one was a steel coffin packed with explosive force powerful enough to break a submarine apart like glass. Mercer reached for the fuse on the nearest charge and armed something the Navy had never proved. If stories like this, of silent seas, unseen enemies, and ordinary sailors standing at the edge of history, matter to you, subscribe now to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us in the comments where you are watching from around the world. From frozen Atlantic nights to forgotten battles, this channel preserves the courage history nearly lost. The first explosion thundered through the water like the tearing of the sea itself. The second followed in a pattern no U-boat captain had ever studied. The third arrived when the submarine commander least expected it. Deep below, steel plates buckled, valves ruptured, lights died, and in seconds, a German submarine that had stalked Allied shipping for months became a descending tomb. On the Callaway, no one yet understood why the kill had been so sudden. They only knew the contact vanished. This was the first time Mercer's forbidden modification touched the war. The North Atlantic did not react to death. It absorbed it. Oil bloomed briefly on the surface, then vanished beneath foam and churned water. The Callaway returned to escort position as if nothing exceptional had happened. The convoy steamed onward toward Europe, unaware it had just crossed a subtle threshold in underwater warfare. For the next 48 hours, the Atlantic delivered only silence. No torpedo wakes, no alarms, just wind and ice, and the steady grind of propellers against water. Sailors slept in short, restless shifts. Every sound in the hull was suspect. Pipes groaned. Bulkheads shuddered. Men dreamed of impacts that never came. Mercer did not sleep. He sat below deck with grease-stained hands, recalibrating the fuses of the remaining charges by feel. Each adjustment violated technical orders, burned into every sailor's training. He did not erase safety margins by accident. He did it deliberately. He had watched too many approved attack patterns fail. He had seen depth charges explode behind fleeing U-boats, too shallow or too late, as torpedoes raced upward toward innocent ships. He believed predictability was killing them. 3 hours before dawn on March 20th, the sonar screamed again. A second contact. Closer this time. Faster. The Callaway broke formation and accelerated into the dark. Snow lashed the deck. Waves struck like blunt weapons. Men raced to positions, shouting into the wind. The ocean became a battlefield of sound and vibration. Mercer rolled the first charge. The explosion shook the ship violently enough to rattle teeth. The second detonation arrived not behind the first, but beneath the enemy's expected turning arc. The third arrived deeper than doctrine allowed. On the sonar screen, the contact shuddered, split, and vanished into a spreading cloud of debris. Another U-boat was gone. Still, no one asked how. Word began to spread quietly among the fleet that the Callaway had become unusually lethal. Some whispered about luck. Others spoke of cursed seas. Veteran sonar men exchanged uneasy glances. No destroyer escort should be that effective against boats that had terrorized the Atlantic for 4 brutal years. 3 nights later, the storm came. Winds howled at hurricane force. Waves swallowed the bowhole. Rain fell like blown needles. Sonar barely functioned as water churned with constant interference. Visibility collapsed to nothing. The Atlantic erased all lines between sky and sea. That was when the third U-boat attacked. Torpedoes raced unseen through the black chaos. One missed the Callaway by less than 30 yards. Steel screamed as escort ships maneuvered blindly. Depth charges were deployed in desperation. Detonations lost in the thunder of the storm itself. Mercer adjusted again. He always adjusted. Somewhere beneath the fury of the surface, the submarine commander rolled his boat into what he believed was safety. The ocean fooled him. The delayed explosion struck where doctrine said no charge would ever reach. The shockwave crushed pressure hull and crew alike. The contact did not fade this time. It collapsed instantly into nothing. At dawn, broken wreckage floated briefly among the gray waves. Helmets. Wood. A single oil-slick glove. 3 U-boats in less than a week. If you are listening from any corner of the world right now and feel the tension of these moments, quietly choose to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. These are the stories the oceans tried to bury, and the places you are watching from become part of keeping them alive. By April, the Callaway was being whispered about across multiple convoys. Some captains began requesting her as escort. Others avoided her out of superstition. The Atlantic had a way of punishing arrogance. 7 U-boats would be officially credited to the Callaway over the next 4 months. 7 predators removed from the deep, without survivors. But in a sealed room far from the salt and darkness, men in uniform stared at classified charts with growing concern. One of the destroyed submarines had transmitted a partial distress signal moments after sustaining fatal internal damage. The fragments of that transmission described a sequence of underwater detonations that did not match any approved American depth charge doctrine. The explosions arrived from directions that theory said were impossible. The pattern was unfamiliar, illegal. Someone, somewhere in the U.S. Navy, was playing with the physics of anti-submarine warfare. An internal investigation was opened without announcement. No warnings were issued. No questions were asked aloud aboard the Callaway. Investigators listened, tracked, compared sonar logs to official weapon settings. Slowly, the pattern pointed toward one quiet petty officer who never spoke unless spoken to. Mercer sensed the change before anyone confronted him. The glances were longer. The conversations halted when he entered a compartment. Officers began appearing unexpectedly near the depth charge racks. Once, he found one of his modified charges removed and replaced with an approved unit. He replaced it back when no one was watching. Months before, during a grim rescue in open water, Mercer had pulled a wounded German sailor from the ocean after a U-boat destruction. The man was dying. Hypothermia had already begun to still his limbs. With his last breath, through chattering teeth and lips turning blue, the submariner had whispered a warning in broken English. "Your patterns are known." U-boat captains, he said, studied American depth charge tactics like textbooks. Every interval, every standard delay, every safe arc predictability was no longer protection. It was a blueprint for survival. Mercer never reported that confession. He altered the fuses that same night. On the surface, the Atlantic appeared calmer now. Fewer attacks, fewer torpedoes slicing through moonlit water. But beneath the calm, tactics on both sides were evolving faster than doctrine could follow. And the Navy was closing in. If you feel your pulse rising as these silent battles unfold, Subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends now, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are hearing this story. Somewhere beneath the waves, history is still waiting to be uncovered. On the night of July 6, 1943, after the seventh confirmed sinking, the ocean fell unnaturally quiet. No sonar pings, no distant explosions, no torpedo wakes, just darkness and wind and the slow creak of steel under stress. Then, without warning, a coded message arrived from Fleet Command. All non-standard depth charge modifications were immediately outlawed. All ships were ordered to return to strict doctrinal configurations. No reason was given. No explanation followed. Mercer was removed from duty the next morning under armed escort. The convoy sailed on without him, and beneath the frozen surface of the Atlantic, unanswered questions sank with the last echoes of unlawful explosions. The war beneath the waves had just entered its most dangerous phase. The North Atlantic did not protest when Daniel Mercer vanished from the deck of the USS Callaway. The sea only rolled on, indifferent, as the convoy steamed ahead without him. On paper, the removal was described as a routine transfer. In reality, it was an arrest carried out without ceremony, without explanation, without a single word spoken to the man whose hands had altered the course of 7 underwater battles. Mercer was taken below decks, then transferred at the next rendezvous under armed guard to a transport headed west. No charges were read. No accusations were voiced. The ship's crew was ordered to forget him, and like most sailors in wartime, they obeyed. In the days that followed, the Atlantic reclaimed its confidence. Torpedoes returned to the sea lanes as if summoned by the sudden vacuum left behind. Convoys that had crossed in uneasy calm now erupted in chaos once more. Fuel ships burned on the surface like floating suns. Ammunition transports disintegrated in vertical firestorms. Lifeboats drifted through oil-slicked water filled with voices that faded one by one into the wind. The enemy had adapted. German U-boat commanders quickly realized something had changed. The abnormal explosion patterns that had haunted them for months were gone. The old doctrine was back. The safe arcs. The predictable delays. The margins they had memorized returned exactly as before, and they used that knowledge ruthlessly. Within 3 weeks, Allied losses in the North Atlantic climbed sharply. Admiralty reports used neutral language. Operational reversals. Increased attrition, shifting tactical balance. But sailors called it what it was. The predators had returned. Far from a sea, Daniel Mercer sat alone in a steel compartment lit by a single bulb that hummed softly through the night. He was questioned in fragments. Long silences, then sudden inquiries about fuse tolerances, detonation delays, hydrostatic pressure curves. No one accused him of sinking U-boats. No one praised him either. They only asked how he had done it. He gave them nothing. Just as the German sailor had carried his warning into the dark months earlier, Mercer now carried his knowledge in silence. He knew the Navy would not publicly admit that a single petty officer had outperformed official doctrine. He also knew something more dangerous. If the Atlantic became predictable again, more convoys would die. And they did. By August 1943, the convoy routes resembled moving funerals. Escort ships zigzagged endlessly through cold water that whispered of torpedoes beneath every swell. Sonar operators lived in a permanent state of fatigue. Every echo could be a death sentence. Every false contact drained what little calm remained in their nerves. Yet beneath the losses, something stranger surfaced in classified intelligence. 2 U-boats vanished during this period under circumstances that did not match any known Allied anti-submarine engagement. No official ships were in the reported zones. No aircraft patrols had logged attacks. No wreckage surfaced. The submarines simply disappeared. Their last transmissions, however, told a different story. Both described erratic, staggered underwater detonations arriving from unexpected depths and angles. The same forbidden signature the Navy had outlawed weeks earlier. Someone else was now using Mercer's pattern. If you sense the mystery tightening beneath the waves right now, quietly subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. The deeper these waters grow, the more history begins to distort. The question no one dared to write into a report was simple. Who was deploying the forbidden charges now? Back in custody, Mercer was confronted again. This time the tone shifted. The questions sharpened. A file was opened in front of him, thick with sonar plots and altered detonation diagrams. His work, his fingerprints on the physics of warfare. The Navy's investigators had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. His illegal modification worked too well. But wartime institutions were not built to celebrate disobedience. They existed to preserve order. And order had been violated in ways they could not publicly defend. To acknowledge Mercer's success would be to admit that doctrine had cost lives long after it could have been rewritten. So the Navy chose silence. And silence became policy. Mercer was released without trial. No commendation. No field citation. No official reprimand either. He was transferred inland to a training facility where his hands would never touch live explosives again. His records were quietly sealed. His name removed from operational logs. Yet beneath that bureaucratic erasure, the Atlantic continued to speak. In September 1943, a convoy avoiding known patrol routes sailed directly into a region officially declared free of U-boats. Within minutes, torpedoes tore through its center like knives through cloth. 3 ships were lost before escorts could even respond. Survivors later reported hearing underwater thunder that did not resemble any known Allied weapon. The forbidden signature again. By autumn, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Official doctrine had returned. Losses had surged. Yet isolated submarine disappearances continued to bear the unmistakable fingerprint of Mercer's staggered detonation pattern. The Navy had banned the weapon, but the ocean did not recognize bans. Somewhere in the Atlantic, someone beyond official command was still fighting the deep in a language only a single petty officer had once spoken fluently. And the war beneath the waves was becoming a battle of secrets as much as steel. If your instinct tells you this story is heading somewhere no official report ever dared to admit, subscribe now to WW2 Frontline Legends. These are the shadows where forgotten decisions still echo. By December, Allied commanders faced a paradox they could neither explain nor openly discuss. Their safest tactics had once failed. Their forbidden tactics now reappeared without authorization. The ledger of war no longer balanced cleanly between cause and effect. Mercer was summoned one last time. This meeting took place not in an interrogation room, but in a quiet office overlooking a frozen inland river far from any ocean. An admiral stood at the window while Mercer remained seated in shadow. No formal charges were ever read. No confessions demanded. Only one question was spoken. How many men did your modification save? Mercer did not answer. He thought instead of the dying German sailor pulled from the water, of the whispered warning, of the faces of merchant crews vanishing into black seas, of the 7 confirmed kills that would never again speak, of the unofficial ones that now vanished beyond all records. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, enough to make it dangerous. The admiral turned back to the window. Outside, the river creaked beneath its skin of ice. That winter, without announcement or public revision, experimental research into variable delay depth charges quietly resumed at distant naval proving grounds. The work was classified, the funding unlisted, the logs buried beneath layers of administrative language designed to mean nothing. The Atlantic, however, was still demanding answers in blood. And the greatest mystery of the undersea war was no longer how U-boats hunted. It was who now hunted them in secret. The final echoes of forbidden explosions were still moving through the deep, unheard by the world that sailed above. By early 1944, the North Atlantic had become a ledger written in 2 inks. One visible, one forbidden. On the surface, the naval war followed the official story. Standard escort patterns. approved depth charge settings. Rising Allied numbers slowly tipping the balance. On paper, the U-boat threat was weakening. Beneath the surface, the sea told a different account. Submarines continued to vanish in places where no authorized Allied attack had taken place. Their final transmissions, when they existed at all, spoke of explosions arriving from impossible angles. Some described pressure waves that did not follow known physics. Others ended mid-sentence, cut short by forces their captains had never trained against. No wreckage was officially recovered. No victories were officially recorded. In war rooms across the Atlantic world, officers studied these vanishings in silence. They could not deny the pattern. They also could not acknowledge its origin without unraveling years of doctrine, command authority, and the legal structure that had condemned one man for thinking faster than policy allowed. Daniel Mercer never returned to sea. He was reassigned to shore duty and then to work so far removed from explosives that even mentioning depth charges became forbidden. Yet his mind remained in the Atlantic. Every night, he replayed the old sonar contacts in memory. The spacing, the delays, the way the water itself seemed to pause between detonations before collapsing inward. He knew exactly what his modification did to a submarine hull. It did not merely crack it. It confused it to death. U-boat commanders relied on patterns to survive. They evaded by mathematics as much as instinct. Cancel the pattern, and the mathematics turned against them. The ocean became unpredictable again, and unpredictability underwater was fatal. Mercer's work had introduced chaos into a war that had grown terrifyingly orderly beneath the waves. And chaos, once released, did not return easily to its cage. In June 1944, as Allied armies crashed onto the beaches of Europe, the Atlantic convoys surged with renewed urgency. Fuel for tanks, ammunition for artillery, men by the tens of thousands crossing waters that had already claimed too many. Officially, the U-boat menace was in retreat. Unofficially, the disappearances continued. 2 more submarines vanished that summer under conditions that once again bore the forbidden signature. No escorts logged attacks. No aircraft filed combat reports. The sea offered no answers. Only silence. Inside sealed Navy archives, analysts compared sonar data from these unexplained vanishings to Mercer's original modifications. The match was precise, down to the microsecond of delay between detonations. Someone somewhere was still using his design, and they were very careful not to be seen. By 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing inward toward its final act. Germany's cities burned. Its armies fell back on every front. The battle beneath the Atlantic began to thin as fuel, crews, and functional submarines became scarce. Yet the classified files continued to grow. Whispers circulated through intelligence channels of an unofficial network of modified escorts operating under no recorded fleet designation. Crews that did not appear on standard rosters. Ships that departed ports without public orders. Weapon systems listed only in experimental annexes stamped for destruction after review. Nothing could be proven. Everything was suspected. Mercer was never called to testify. He was never reinstated. He was never formally accused again. The Navy behaved as if he had never existed at sea at all. But in late 1945, after the guns fell silent and the Atlantic finally returned to something resembling peace, a quiet decision was made. Without announcement, without explanation, without apology, the Navy legalized variable delay depth charge detonations. The very modification once labeled dangerous to friendly vessels was now rewritten into standard doctrine. 2 years had passed since Mercer's arrest. 2 years of storm, sinking, secrecy, and quiet experimentation beneath the waves. Official records credited no individual for the change. No commendations were issued. No court-martial charges were reversed. The Atlantic swallowed the paper trail the same way it swallowed the wrecks. Years later, a clerk working deep in a sealed records facility uncovered a thin folio misfiled among weather reports. It contained 3 sonar plots never entered into any battle ledger. each marked with handwritten timing increments that did not exist in any pre-1943 manual, each corresponding to a vanished submarine, each dated months after Mercer had been removed from active service. No ship names were listed, only coordinates. When officials realized what had been found, the folio disappeared. Those coordinates remain classified to this day. Somewhere in the dark layers of the Atlantic seabed, steel tombs lie that were never officially sunk by anyone. The question has never been answered. Who deployed the forbidden charges after Mercer was gone? It was not doctrine. It was not command. It was not recorded. Perhaps it was a rogue crew that refused to return to predictable death. Perhaps it was a covert unit operating beyond formal accountability. Perhaps it was something even simpler. Knowledge, once released into war, cannot be recalled. It migrates. It learns new hands. The ocean did not care who fired the charges. It only closed over the result. In the quiet years after the war, as shipping returned to peaceful routes and the Atlantic forgot the fury of torpedoes and sonar pings, Mercer lived out his life without public story or ceremony. No medals, no interviews, no official biography. To the world, he was simply another name that never appeared in headlines. But beneath the waves, his work remained. Every modern depth charge doctrine descends, in part, from those outlawed adjustments made on frozen nights in 1943. The mathematics of irregular detonation, now taught in classrooms, once lived only in the silent defiance of one petty officer who had listened to a dying enemy and believed him. The Atlantic keeps many secrets. Some are swallowed by violence, others by paperwork, and some by the convenient silence of institutions that cannot afford to admit that a single disobedient sailor once saved more lives than any rulebook ever anticipated. If this hidden battle beneath the waves moved you, if forgotten courage still matters to you, subscribe now to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us in the comments where you are watching from around the world. Somewhere beneath every quiet ocean, history is still waiting to be heard. And far below the surface, beyond all charts and commendations, the final echoes of forbidden explosions are still fading through black water that never learned the meaning of permission.